Para el siguiente panel de expertos, invitamos nuevamente a la señora Amy Coupal y a Yolanda Carlos. Las acompañarán también la doctora Patricia Breen y la señora Anita Sherwin-Hamer. Además, el señor Paul Neira será el moderador de este panel. Los invitamos a subir al estrado. En primer lugar, invitamos a la señora Amy Coupal para que responda a la pregunta: ¿qué es educar y cómo podemos hacerlo mejor?
Okay, thank you so much. This is a very interesting question, and what I noted in talking with the other people on the stage here who are going to answer this question is that we each took a different type of perspective, but that there are some common themes that you perhaps will see emerging from our ideas today. For me, the question of what does it mean to educate really comes down to how are we preparing our students for a future that we can't really foresee and don't totally understand. If you think about the world that you lived in when you were in kindergarten or grade 6 or finishing high school, I would suspect that anybody in this room would say that the world that existed at that time is different from the world today. And if we think about the exponential pace of change, it's easy to imagine that the world that the students who are going through school today or 5 years from now will graduate and work in a world that we can't really comprehend. So for me, education has to come back to those core skills, capabilities, and understandings that students need to have to prepare them for those unknowns. Because even if we imagine, we can't get it right necessarily. So the 21st century skills are a core part of the dialogue that we participate in education, and I think that they can be transferred regardless of grade, regardless of subject, regardless of where you are in the world. And actually, Manuel, you emphasized a number of these in your presentation, and you saw evidence, I think, of this in some of the programs that you have for your students. And you see as well, what I heard from you that I thought was really important is that you hear from employers that this is what they're looking for. And that to me speaks volumes about what it is to educate. We need to prepare our students to be active, contributing members of our society, to be successful in their work, to be successful citizens and contributors in their communities and societies. So the information that you see up here is actually from a document from the Ontario Principals Council, which is the organization that Joanne Robinson is from, who I spoke with this morning. And I think this is a great list that targets a number of the themes that you talked about, Manuel. How do we foster emotional intelligence? And usually with our young students, that starts with awareness and building that awareness of yourself and your feelings and what you notice in other people. Critical thinking and analytical skills, problem-solving skills, and I think problem-solving is coming up as a core practice, and perhaps my colleagues will talk about that in terms of going well beyond rote learning and looking at how we actually tackle real-world challenges or real applications in the subjects that you teach. Looking at creativity and innovation, and what I appreciated as well, Manuel, about what you talked about is the importance of fostering that dialogue and creativity amongst educators as well as amongst students. If we don't model that in the work that we do together, we won't have the opportunity to practice, fail, try again, and we need to create a context in which the students can do the same thing. Creativity and innovation is very hard to do when there's an expectation of perfection or only one target to meet. So it requires multiple possibilities, multiple avenues for success for students. Communication skills, again, came up as a theme this morning already and this afternoon today. Technological skills, and I'll be talking a little bit about this tomorrow. For me personally, and in much of the dialogue that I have with my colleagues who know much more about this than I do, I think the collective agreement is technology is a tool. And so really we have to connect the technology with the pedagogy, and that will create the meaningful experiences for our students. If we can help them have real applications of that technology in their learning, then we will prepare them for those real applications of technology which they will inevitably experience in their work. And if we extract the technology from the classroom and yet they experience it everywhere else in the world, how are we facilitating a disconnection for them? We have to bridge that gap and help them have those experiences in school that will reflect the world that they experience elsewhere, and most certainly be reflected in their world of work, where they will be expected to use technology as a practical tool, as a communication tool, as a collaboration tool, etc. So I'm just going to continue with a couple of other concepts that align with this. We talked this morning about entrepreneurship, and I think that this is another core piece that we as educators have to think about. Whether your students go on and run their own businesses, having that business sense and that sense of value in the work that we do, I think is very, very important. And if we can foster that understanding and some of those practices with students and tie it in with social responsibility and helping to understand some of the relationships between entrepreneurship and social responsibility, will serve them very well. And the final piece that I would call out in here is around accessing and analyzing information. When we talk about what it means to educate today, we have to go beyond knowledge acquisition. We have to be looking at critically the information we engage with, the information we have access to, what new perspectives, new data, new exposure to experiences gives us, and how we integrate that information and how we help students integrate that information. That has to be part of the role of educators today. So that information came from OPC, and the next two quick pieces that I want to share with you come from an organization in Canada, and I encourage you to take a look at some of these documents. What they have tried to do for us in Canada is create a consolidation of some of the research on 21st century learning. And I feel some conflict with the term 21st century learning, because I think many of us feel that it's outdated, and many of us wonder if it's the best term, but until somebody has a better, bright idea, it's the term that we use. And I think at the end of the day, regardless of grade, regardless of subject, to educate students means to help develop those 21st century skills that, regardless of the career that they go into, whether it is a career that we can even understand today or conceptualize today, we have to support the development of these types of skills. And I'll call it on this list something that you highlighted, Manuel, several times, which is around ethics. And this is a debate amongst educators, especially if we're talking about different types of schools. But if we build a self-awareness for students, and if we build a sense of responsibility within their community, then perhaps we can help to foster some of those innate senses of ethics that we all have as human beings. And we need to be able to do that, because those interpersonal relationships, seeing ourselves as a part of a community, whether that community is your classroom or your school or your broader community, that's how we work. And so it's time, I think, to really challenge ourselves to break down the walls of our classrooms, perhaps literally, but also metaphorically, and the same with our schools. And we see some very successful models of schools that are deeply connected with the community, where students have the opportunity to engage with the world outside of the walls of their schools. And I think that gives them great exposure to learning that they can apply in school and that they can apply in their life going forward. And so finally, I want to share what I think is a really interesting piece of information coming again from C21 Canada around the system drivers. And so I'll leave this for you as perhaps a point of reflection. When we think about preparing students for the future, when we think about what it means to educate, we must think about this systemically. And I hope you're not too bored of hearing about the systemic conversation, but I think it's really important. We need to look at curriculum, We need to look at our learning environments. We need to look at the governance in education, our pedagogical practices, our assessment practices, and looking at how we engage as citizens and stakeholders. We need to look at these for ourselves as the leaders in the education system, and we need to consider those implications for our students. And I think those are some of our core responsibilities when we think about what our responsibility is as educators.
Muchas gracias. A continuación, un aplauso. A continuación, invitamos a la señora Yolanda Carlos a brindar su respuesta a la pregunta planteada.
I will be focusing on assessment. When we look at students and when we're teaching, assessment is what gives us the direction and the understanding of where we need to go. So when we think about assessment and we think about data, we have to understand that that's how we assess learning. And what we did at Pacific Oaks is that we looked at our curriculum, we looked at our syllabi, and we decided that we needed to standardize things so that the data collection would become simpler. What we needed to do was to identify the student learning objectives, what we wanted them to learn, the institutional learning objectives and what those were, and then we needed to look at the core competencies or the standards. How we standardized it is that we decided that one assignment would be considered a signature assignment. Within that signature assignment, we would apply real-world application to it. So every course would cover in their signature assignment the ILOs, the SLOs, the core competencies, and any standards. So the real-world application, what might that look like? The assignment could be an observation. It could be the application of lesson plans, of storytelling through storyboard or actual working with children. And they would capture the data through photographs and then documentation of their work. It could also be through project-based learning and case studies. So within those, we built the elements that we needed to collect the data so that we could look at our curriculum maps to decide, are we indeed meeting the needs of students? Are we providing the direction? And can we provide confirmation for student preparation and final degree conferral for 21st century workforce needs, and more importantly for life? But we didn't want to be so prescriptive that it leaves no room for the professional judgment. There still had to be enough room left for the creativity and for the professional wisdom within the coursework for the instructors to be able to have some leeway there. And then finally in the end, when we look at data in a way that we can collect it to say, yes, we have provided the students with everything they need, and when they go out, we feel proud, we know they're going to make a difference. They have experienced a transformative education. I always like to think of the 3 R's. I like to say that I am going to model it, and as I model it, that my students will embrace it. To be responsible for my learning and for what I teach, to make sure that I'm doing it in a passionate way so that it is transmitted and they get it. And the second one is resourceful, to help our students to understand what it means to be resourceful, because in the world, things are not easy. And we have to be resourceful because funds don't always come through the way we want them to, and we have to look to see what the resources are and how can we tap into them, whatever it may be. When you go into education, responsible and resourceful. And then lastly, resilience. To be resilient, because in life, we are going to have obstacles. We're going to face barriers, and we have to push forward, and we have to continue. Otherwise, we will never reach our goals. And if we don't model that, how can we expect that? So that's really in a nutshell, the assessment in a small way, what it means to assess, to collect data. It can be as simple as one signature assignment that can be applicable to real life learning. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señora Carlos. En tercer lugar tendremos la participación de la doctora Patricia Breen. Cuenta con más de 30 años de experiencia en la administración de la educación superior. Actualmente se desempeña como presidente de Pacific Oaks College y Escuela Infantil. Recibió su PhD en Desarrollo Humano y Organización de Fielding Graduate University. Sus intereses incluyen la evaluación y mejora de aprendizaje de los estudiantes, los adultos como aprendices y el liderazgo de la educación superior. La doctora Breen es miembro activo del Consejo de Escuelas de Posgrado y ha sido consultora y evaluadora para la Comisión de Estudios Superiores de la North Central Association de Escuelas y Universidades y de el Senior College and University Commission's WASC.
Buenas tardes, everyone. I really am sitting here like I think many of you are, just being amazed at how much similarity there is in our commentary on what education is and the new knowledge that's emerging about what education is and how to improve it in the future. But I have to tell you that I loved thinking about this question, what is education and how to improve it in this day of unparalleled change and new knowledge development, and it's a time that I don't think is ever going to go back to the old days where we could kind of sit and wait and let things happen. We really have to get out in front of it. So, so listening to all these different ways of talking about what education is, I think is actually a great way to learn, because we're cycling through some of the same content, but with different applications, different contexts. And the context that I'd like to present for your consideration today is the idea of education as a developmental process. One that means that that education is more than new knowledge. It's becoming an educated person and retaining that ability to be an educated person throughout your life. Hold on, I have too many gadgets here. Okay, so talking first about transformative learning, you know, this is a concept that's been around a while, and in fact, the word transformation itself is something of a cliche in higher education right now, or at least it is in the United States. In fact, when we talk about it to our marketing folks, I say, let's not use that word anymore because it's so overused that it's kind of lost its meaning. But nevertheless, that's kind of sad because it's a good word and it means more than just being better at something. I think I've got an old definition up here, a definition from Mesro, that gives you an idea of what transformation means to us today. It's developing new knowledge is an essential requirement of becoming an educated person, right? But no longer is it sufficient. It really does mean to develop an educated person is to transform a person into a learner. Here you see on this slide Mesro's definition, but my own take on educating as a transformative process is developing a learner, the person who's confident enough in their own ability to learn that they're confident enough to challenge where they are about learning and to change as their world changes with them, to explore it, to test it out, to see what sticks, and to learn and grow continuously. And that's the basis of the pedagogy we use at our college, Pacific Oaks. And as such, one of the most important commitments we make to educating or to this transformative process is creating an environment that's nurturing, uncritical, and open. You've heard this already several times today. The ability and the encouragement to fail, to take risks, to learn from that and move on, and that's what scholars do. You know, and then the second part of our question was, and how do you improve education? Well, hold on, let me get my gadget here. I think we're going to have to tap into what motivates people to learn. And one of the most exciting things for me since I started at Pacific Oaks College and Children's School is understanding just how similar the learning process is for both children and adults. Adult learning has been my field for many years, but when I saw what our teachers do at our children's school to create a progressive approach to education, which says we're not really developing children who can do a worksheet quickly or even accurately, who can read by the time they're 3 years old. They're really developing children who love to learn and love to take risks and try it out and experiment with new things and share it with others and see what others do with that information and then move on. And then let's go back to some of the classic information about how adults learn. It's the same enjoyment, the same motivation, because they've got some control over that learning process, and they're able to experiment, to fail, to learn from it, and to move on. And as such, as I mentioned before, what we try to do is create that environment that allows you to challenge yourself, to fail, to try it again. And that's the environment we strive to create at both of our children's school and our college. And whether a student is 3 years old or 43. In fact, at our college, most of our students are about 43. So this is the little piece of marketing that we use on our children's school information, igniting curiosity, creativity, and compassion that lasts a lifetime. And I think that's what it means to make education better, is to create learners who are lifelong learners because they are motivated to learn. They love the process of learning. They feel they have some control over that process, and they continuously change and they know how to continuously change in order to respond to the needs of the 21st century and their own world. Thank you very much.
Finalmente responderá la pregunta planteada la señora Anita Sherwin-Hamer. Ella es consultora de Curriculum Services Canada International Services. Actualmente supervisa la evaluación de libros para el Ministerio de Educación en Ontario y ha trabajado con profesores y directores en la concientización sobre el impacto de las prácticas de evaluación apropiadas en la instrucción y aprendizaje. Sherwin-Hamer tiene experiencia en liderazgo instruccional y el desarrollo de comunidades de aprendizaje profesional.
Gracias. Buenas tardes, everyone. When I was first presented with this question, I must admit, I wasn't as excited as Pat was. I thought, how can I possibly answer this question in 10 minutes? I thought the best thing to do was just to think about my 40 years in education and all the things I've read, and then just try and very quickly jot down some notes. And what happened was I came up with my philosophy, and it really does mirror or reflect much of what was said today. So just as you said, Pat, we're all thinking along the same lines. And so what I want to share with you is my thoughts from the last 40 years. So for me, to educate means to provide opportunities for students to become lifelong learners who continually seek self-improvement. I've often marveled how children learn, and Pat, you touched on this, and I'm sure a lot of you have sat on occasion and just watched the way children learn. They have an innate desire to learn, and they have a great capacity to learn. And I think as educators, we have to find ways to preserve that motivation and to nurture that capacity to learn. When you think about all the children who come into our school systems so excited and so ready to learn, and within a few years, we lose many of those children to boredom or to a feeling that they're not going to be successful. So what should we be doing as educators to make sure that they're still motivated and that they still want to learn and that they still feel that they can learn? Well, I think probably the most important thing is to have an environment where they really feel encouraged to ask questions. Let them ask questions and seek out answers, and as they go through our systems, let them do that with increased levels of sophistication. So that means we need to engage them in inquiry. Inquiry-based learning, where they develop the critical and creative thinking skills that are going to serve them well in their adult lives. They also need opportunities to collaborate with others so that they can learn from others and others can learn from them. And here I have in mind the work of Peter Senge. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Peter Senge and his learning community, but a few years ago I read the book Schools That Learn. It's a large, large book. Well worth the read though, because in that book, Senge talks about how we all have to become masters of self-improvement. That's what it's all about. We all have to continue to learn. We all have to continue to improve ourselves. That's what systems thinking is all about. The systems in the universe survive because they continue to adapt, and new processes unfold, and the world improves. And that's the way it has to be for students as well. Students obviously need opportunities that challenge them at the right level of difficulty. Can't be too hard, can't be too easy. And here I'm thinking of Vygotsky's proximal zone of development, where you challenge the student just beyond what they're able to do. And you have that capable other, either another teacher or another student, there to help them along. Students also need challenges that are meaningful to their lives and that engage them in making products that are significant beyond just getting a grade. So gone are the days when we would give a project on Peru, for example, where the students would research all kinds of facts and draw all kinds of pictures about Peru. Students need genuine intellectual work. That's not intellectual work. They need genuine intellectual work with relevance and purpose. They also need opportunities to monitor their learning, to understand how they learn, and to set goals for continued learning. And here I'm thinking of a Canadian actually, Ann Davies, her work on classroom assessment. And I'll be talking a little bit about that tomorrow in my keynote address. Students also need to remain open to new learning, and a few of my colleagues today talked about being open to new learning, and Carol Dweck was mentioned, I believe, by Joanne Robinson. She has done a lot of research on the growth mindset. Costa and Kallick, too, with their works on habits of mind, are really talking about the same thing, that students need to feel confident and resilient, full of awe, wanting to learn, always open to new learning. So how do we make sure that's happening? How do we make our education systems better? Well, I think we need to focus on inquiry-based learning, which a lot of systems now are doing. But you just can't pay lip service to that. You have to give the students the genuine skills of inquiry-based learning, and at a very young age. And there has to be lots of opportunities to practice those skills. We need to focus on problem-based learning. So for example, if students are learning about environmentalism, they're not just going to read about stewardship. What we should be doing is encouraging them to go into their community and to look at what the issues there are in terms of stewardship, and to see whether or not they can develop a plan to solve some of those issues. We need to nurture our students' ability to work as a learning community. And I just realized I forgot to change my slides. Too many gadgets. Students who are in a true learning community are really comfortable about asking questions. There are no silly questions. And they're also very comfortable at looking at new and different ways of thinking. We don't always have to do it the same way, just because we've always done it that way. We don't always have to think the same way, because we've always thought that way. We have to ensure that the students' programming needs are met in terms of learning style, level of difficulty, and authenticity. The industrial model of education just does not work anymore. I remember there was someone today with a graphic of a factory and the assembly line students coming out. Students are not commodities that you can produce on an assembly line. They each have their own learning profile. And we need to think of ways to challenge that profile. We have to ensure that students are competent at assessing their own learning and setting individual learning goals. And by this I mean embracing assessment for learning, which by the way is my topic tomorrow. When you embrace assessment for learning, the learning goals and success criteria for the students are clear and are referenced throughout the learning process. And students become increasingly more responsible for self-directed, self-regulated learning. That's the goal. Another thing we need to do is to ensure that our students feel safe and confident as learners. We're very proactive in Ontario about this particular aspect because we know that no learning takes place unless these elements are present. We need to improve the teaching learning environment through high quality teacher training, and we've heard that a few times today, haven't we? The best investment you can make for improved student learning is by investing in your teachers. We've really, really committed ourselves to that in Ontario, and the results, the PISA results, show that. There has to be continuous opportunities for teachers to learn and collaborate with one another. Just as we seek for our students to become a learning community, we have to give that same opportunity to the teachers. We need a standards-based curriculum, which incorporates approaches to teaching and learning that promote some of the things that I've been talking about: inquiry, problem solving, and connections to the real world. You know, I read an article recently that said that it was impossible to have a standards-based curriculum and true inquiry-based learning. And the author of this article made some very sound points, but didn't convince me. Because I've seen teachers in Ontario who have been able to follow a standards-based curriculum and develop an environment where students are truly engaged in inquiry. It's possible, but you need highly trained teachers to do that. And if you're not investing in the development of those teachers and the continuous development of those teachers, then it does become an impossibility. Of course, you need the appropriate resources. You need resources that support curriculum delivery, including technological resources. And these resources should support students in activities that connect them to the broader community of learners. Technology needs to be used so that students have opportunities to learn in ways not possible without technology. And here I'm thinking of Pointe-du-Douar's SAMR model, and I believe Amy will be talking about that tomorrow. So you don't use technology to substitute a worksheet. You use technology to have students share documents with other students on the other side of the world. Because that's what technology allows our students to do. We need to focus on evidence of learning. There's a very well-known educator in Ontario that has a phrase that I just love. She says, you have to have a high tolerance for the truth and a desire for improved outcomes for all. We must not be afraid of the data. And believe me, I've been a principal, and there have been times when I was afraid of the data that was going to come out in my school. As long as the data is quality data, and there's lots of discussion about that, and as long as it doesn't overwhelm the teachers who have to collect it, then I think we really need to make friends with the data. And even if it's data that isn't so good, no one's to blame, as long as everyone is willing to confront the data and say, this is the reality, now where do we go from here? Is my time up? A minute. Very quickly. We need to focus on school effectiveness. And again, this was all spoken of already, so I don't need to say a lot. Collaborative instructional leadership, a safe, welcoming environment, a culture of high expectations, where there is a belief that all children can learn. Some schools pay lip service to that. The only way there's going to be appropriate programming for all is if everyone truly embraces that. That's when you'll get the programming for every student, no matter what the need is. Timely intervention for the students who aren't learning. You've got to intervene when they're young, and you have to have protocols that everyone follows to bring them up to where everyone else is. Attention to student voice. Listen to what the students have to say when you're developing your school plan. Have strong school-home community partnerships. Evidence-based decision-making. Don't make a decision because somebody thinks it's a good idea or they read about it in some fancy book. It's got to be based on evidence, either evidence that you have discovered yourself through actual research in your own community or through research that someone else has done that parallels the circumstances in your community. And then you need to focus on system effectiveness. So your whole system has to be operating the same way. And that's what Michael Fullan calls coherence, where there's a shared purpose and just a few goals, but lofty goals. And always a focus on instruction and improved learning throughout the system. Collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. So collaboration, system leadership. Capacity building for your leaders and your teachers. And finally, networks of learning communities amongst your schools. So you have 2 or 3 schools who partner, and the teachers share what they're learning. They share evidence of student work and ask for help about next steps. The principals share their best practices and their problems, and they talk collectively about how to solve them. I have actually experienced some of these wonderful things, and it's not without pain, let me tell you, but it's worth it. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a Anita Sherwin. El señor Rodríguez concluirá la rueda
En primer lugar, lo único que me queda me he quedado sorprendido y gratamente agradecido por las contribuciones de cada una de las participantes. Tanto Yolanda como Pat han explicado perfectamente el significado de lo que es educar. De igual forma, Anita y Amy. Y creo que lo único que puedo precisar es que educar es lograr que la persona sea feliz. Y para eso se necesita que descubra las mejores formas de aprender y que ese aprendizaje sea autónomo. Vemos ejemplos excelentes en Estados Unidos, en Canadá, y la experiencia que nos han compartido hoy día es muy enriquecedora y estoy seguro que será aplicada con éxito en cada uno de sus espacios de aprendizaje. Los esperamos luego en la siguiente conferencia con el señor Ayllón. Muchas gracias.